What could be more majestic than the ruins of a medieval castle? Looking at the collapsed towers somewhere in a European country, you automatically imagine beautiful princesses, brave knights, wise kings, wizards, and all the other obligatory attributes of a chivalric romance. And then you stop and think, all right, princesses are fine, but how was this place actually heated? There were no boiler rooms, and the area is huge. Today, we will try to figure this out, along with other practical questions about living in a knightly castle. You're watching History's Omitted, where stories don't just get told, they finally get explained. It must be said that originally there was absolutely nothing romantic about castles. The era of castles began after the fall of the Roman Empire, when the centralized and civilized state was replaced by a patchwork of loose kingdoms divided into separate domains. Royal power was weak, and real authority belonged to feudal lords, who needed a place to house their families, retinues, and servants. The castle stored supplies and weapons, and in case of attack, the population of nearby villages could shelter there. Or the opposite. Thanks to the castle, the population of those same villages couldn't reach the feudal lord who collected tribute from the entire region. At first, there were no architectural refinements at all. In the 9th and 10th centuries, when castle building was only beginning, they were simply wooden towers surrounded by a moat and a palisade. These were harsh times. Europe was raided and burned from all sides by Vikings, Saracens, Hungarians, and other rather grim characters. And if they didn't rob you, your neighbors might. A castle was a structure of vital importance. A lone tower with an entrance on the second floor. Those who managed to get inside pulled up the ladder and barricaded themselves. And then the Vikings gathered outside had to decide what to do with the structure. Try burning it down, undermining it, or shrug and go look for easier loot. Gradually, landowners accumulated surplus wealth and ungrazed treasures, and by the 11th century, castles acquired the appearance we know today. A stone keep the central building, surrounded by stone walls, ideally on a mountain, or at least on a hill. Between the outer wall and the keep stood wooden buildings for daily life and storage. The keep itself was built for safety, and comfort was the least concern. It was a bunker to move into in a catastrophe. The rest of the time, people lived inside the walls, but in more comfortable structures. The local lord lived in the castle and swore fealty to a higher-ranking feudal overlord. There was no bureaucratic apparatus or standing army at that time. The landowner performed all those functions. He was your court, police, draft office, tax authority, customs, service, everything. He was required to serve with his men for a set number of days per year, usually 40. After that, whatever they negotiated. This sometimes led to comical situations. For example, during an important siege, half the army might simply go home with a clear conscience after fulfilling its duty. There weren't many ways to pressure a disobedient feudal lord. To exert influence on him, you first needed to smoke him out of his castle, no easy task. Vassalage oaths and contracts clearly define the powers of lord and vassal, including the possibility of severing the relationship. Sometimes the agreements were amusing. In one case, a vassal promised military assistance against any living enemy, apparently meaning that in a zombie apocalypse, the lord would be on his own. In another case, vassals stressed that they served their lord of their own free will, who was, quote, no better than them. Inside his castle, the feudal lord was the absolute master. Those who had more than one castle appointed a castellan, the manager. A good lord regularly traveled through his lands to keep track of local affairs. Kings did the same. They even had a formally established right to spend the night in the castles of their vassals. These were very different structures in size and design. The budget option for the poorest knights was simply a sturdy stone tower. The castle of an influential and wealthy lord could resemble a small city. For example, Crac des Chevaliers, the Crusader fortress in modern Syria, was a gigantic complex with numerous internal buildings, warehouses, residential quarters, and utility structures, housing a 2,000-man garrison. Castle owners made themselves comfortable however they could. The main space was the Great Hall, which people tried to improve as best they could. In the late Middle Ages, some halls even had glass windows. Walls were covered with painted wooden panels or draped with tapestries for warmth. If the hall was on the second floor, the floors were wooden. On the ground floor, they might still be dirt. In that case, they were covered with straw and reeds. But naturally, anything could end up in that mix, from spilled beer to bones from last year's feast. Nearby, animals were kept. The aristocracy favored milk and meat, which required barns and slaughter areas. One of the biggest problems was heating. In cold weather, you had to somehow warm a massive space. A simple hearth could barely help. Chimneys appeared later, but didn't fully solve the problem. A stone box is a stone box. Even dukes and counts sometimes had to split fire with themselves. Waking servants at night just to avoid freezing wasn't an option. Overall, life in a castle was quite barracks-like. Personal space for residents appeared very gradually, and only for the owners. In the High Middle Ages, they began building separate oriels for them. Servants and common soldiers couldn't dream of such luxuries. Having their own bed was already fortunate. Despite the stereotype of a filthy Middle Ages, knights understood perfectly well that people needed to wash. The question was how and where. Water had to be carried by hand. At best, a cistern was installed at the top of the castle, from which water flowed down through pipes. There was no sewage system, gravity did the job. Toilets were built into oriels or equipped with slanted chutes, so that waste naturally fell outside the walls and into the moat, or, as a bonus, onto the heads of besiegers. People cared about comfort as best they could. Seats were covered with fabric, the whole with a cushion, and instead of toilet paper, they used wool or linen. But there was an obvious downside. If the waste chute was built carelessly, an enemy could crawl inside. His mood afterward would be exceptionally grim. So mercy was unlikely. As castles grew more complex, they housed more personnel. Every castle needed a garrison. Many knights did not own castles and hired themselves out for service to more fortunate lords. Below them were sergeants, heavily armed soldiers without knightly rank and ordinary infantry. Castle life was supervised by the steward, who managed the entire estate. This was the most qualified job in the castle, essentially the manager of a large enterprise. Finding an honest steward was difficult. The opportunities for skimming, corruption, and theft were abundant. Sometimes a skilled steward became wealthier than many lords. Large castles also required a chaplain. He was typically one of the few people able to read and write, and he handled the administrative paperwork. Depending on the wealth and status of the castle owner, the staff could number in the hundreds. The roster could include, for example, an almoner responsible for distributing alms and leftovers to the poor, and assisting vulnerable groups from widows to prisoners of war. Messengers were another expense. The ravens from Game of Thrones are fantasy. Real knights relied on real people. Being a messenger was thankless work. There are known cases where a recipient disliked the contents of a letter and forced the messenger to eat it. A castle required numerous qualified servants, anywhere from several dozen to several hundred. The most important among them were the cooks and their team. They had to feed the entire household. Cooks practically lived at work and were lucky to get enough sleep. There were also grooms and stable hands to care for the horses. Blacksmiths were indispensable. And then there was the barber, a multi-purpose specialist. Barbers cut hair, shaved beards, performed dental work, minor surgery, and bloodletting. Bloodletting was considered the primary cure for almost everything. And of course, castles housed pages and squires. Boys, including those from noble families, were brought in to help around the household, serve at the table, care for horses and hounds, maintain weapons and armor. This gave them practical skills much more useful for medieval life than reading or arithmetic. At 14, a boy became a squire and began full military training. Gradually, castles became more comfortable. Chandeliers with candles emerged, hoisted to the ceiling with pulleys. Benches with cushions, numerous stoves, and other household improvements. Musicians handled entertainment. Minstrels were well paid. They not only sang and played instruments, but also told stories, jokes, and entertained the Lord as best they could. Poetry became sophisticated, and stories grew long and elaborate. There was a lot of spare time, and ways to kill it were valued highly. Others preferred simpler entertainment. For example, history preserved the life of a jester named Roland le Farter, who received a generous estate from King Henry II of England for his extraordinary talents. Those uninterested in jesters could play chess or go hunting. Despite all this, the castle remained a fortress, and its defenses constantly evolved. The main element was the wall. The higher and thicker, the better. But then came clever ideas. For example, the outer wall was often sloped so that stones dropped from above would ricochet toward the enemy. Arrow loops were narrow outside, but widened inside to allow archers to aim more easily. Towers that projected outward allowed defenders to shoot enemies who came right up against the wall. Above them hung machicolations, openings from which stones, boiling water, or, ideally, boiling oil could be poured. The weakest point was the gate, so it was protected by additional towers, ideally a barbican, an external fortified outpost. Storming a castle was extremely difficult. One had to cross the moat, break the gates, or climb the wall with ladders. And that was just the beginning. While you climbed, stones were dropped on your head, boiling water poured down, and your ladder was pushed back in hopes you'd fall from the height of a third floor and break your legs. Sieges fell into two categories: well-prepared ones with advanced siege technology and long engineering work, and disastrous ones. Catapults and ballistae could theoretically break walls, but it took a lot of time long enough for the castle to serve its purpose. What ultimately killed the medieval castle was the advent of siege artillery. Cannons could blow huge breaches in walls and collapse towers. Castles lost military relevance. Some fell into ruin. Others became prisons or barracks. Still others evolved into noble estates where descendants of knights cut windows into once impregnable walls and installed electricity. A good example is Windsor Castle, residence of the British monarchs. 900 years ago, it was a military base of Norman conquerors. Later, it became a fortress that survived several Civil War sieges. Then, it became a comfortable palace surrounded by luxurious parks, a venue for ceremonies and diplomatic receptions, and eventually, a tourist attraction. On the other hand, thick stone walls are still thick stone walls. Sometimes they come in handy even in the modern world. One of the most dramatic episodes of the Spanish Civil War in the 1,930 seconds was the siege of the Alcázar of Toledo, an ancient royal fortress. And in May 1945, a battle took place at Austria's Castle Itter, where the Nazis held prisoners. That day, SS troops attacked the fortress, which was defended by American soldiers and liberated French captives. They attacked and failed to take it. Thus, a knightly castle withstood its final siege.